The sun bled out across the Wyoming horizon, a wound of bruised purple and raw, burnt orange. It died slowly, pulling the light from the sky and leaving behind long, skeletal shadows that clawed their way across the plains. The sagebrush, gnarled and gray, and the ancient rock formations, weathered by 1,000,000 years of indifference, seemed to stretch and contort in the fading light, becoming things a man might see in a fever dream. The wind never stopped. It was a constant, mournful presence, a high, lonesome whisper that snaked through the tall, dry grass and carried the grit of the earth with it. The dust got everywhere, stinging the eyes, coating the back of the throat, a perpetual reminder that this land was not tamed. It was a place of brutal, staggering beauty, a place that promised a man freedom and a new start, but usually delivered hardship and a quick end. On the edge of this immense emptiness, a collection of ramshackle wooden buildings huddled together as if seeking warmth from one another. This was the town of Redemption. The name was a cruel joke, a bit of poetry from a founder long since dead and buried, a man who must have had a different vision for the place. There was no redemption here, only judgment. It was a town of hard people, their faces etched with the same lines the wind and sun had carved into the land. They were shaped by scarcity and suspicion, their beliefs as narrow as the single dusty street that ran through the center of town. Survival in Redemption meant blending in, keeping your head down, and sharing the same quiet prejudices as your neighbors. To stand apart was to paint a target on your own back. A mile outside of town, in a small, dilapidated cabin that looked as weary as the land it sat on, lived Alara Hayes. She was 19 years old, but the grief she carried was a heavy cloak, adding a decade of sorrow to her eyes and a permanent slump to her shoulders. Her exile was a quiet, two-sided arrangement. She had imposed it on herself, unable to bear the stares and whispers, and the community ruthlessly enforced it, their fear and loathing a wall as real as any stockade fence. Her isolation was a physical thing, a silence so profound it seemed to have its own weight. Her life was measured in small, heartbreaking rituals, by the weak, sputtering light of a single tallow candle. Her needle would darn the threadbare fabric of her only good dress, the steady rhythm of the stitch a small anchor in the vast sea of her days. Each morning, she walked a loop through the scrubland, her heart a cold knot in her chest as she checked the snares she had set. A rabbit, kicking in the wire, meant fresh meat. An empty snare meant another day of dried beans and cold regret. From the cracked pane of glass in her window, she would stare out at the endless plains, the same plains that had swallowed her family whole a year ago. The memory was always there, lurking just behind her eyes, waiting for a moment of quiet to rush in. Her parents, her little brother, Samuel, their faces filled with the hopeful anxiety of starting a new life. They had been on the trail to redemption, so close they could almost taste the clean water and feel the safety of a roof over their heads. The men they had hired as guides, 2 men with easy smiles and dead eyes, had led them into a box canyon. Alara had survived only because Samuel had dropped his treasured whittling knife, and she had scrambled down into a rocky crevice to retrieve it just as the first shot rang out. She had huddled there, small and terrified, her hands pressed over her ears, but she could not block out the sounds. Those sounds were the ghosts that haunted her sleep and walked with her during the day. The town marshal, Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut hung over his gun belt, had ridden out, taken a quick look around, and declared it a tragic but closed case. He spoke in a low, suggestive tone to the men gathered in the saloon, planting the seed of an idea. The Hayes family were outsiders, after all. Strangers, who knew what kind of trouble they might have been carrying with them. A man does not get ambushed for no reason. The townsfolk, fearful of the violence that lurked just beyond their fragile civilization and always eager for a simple explanation, seized on this narrative. It was easier than admitting a pack of killers roamed the territory unchecked. It was easier to blame the victims. The whispers started small, like rustling leaves, then grew into a steady, corrosive wind. The girl, Alara, was cursed. She must have been complicit somehow. She had survived. Had she not? She had lured the devil to their doorstep, and her continued presence was a constant, unwelcome reminder of their own vulnerability. Into this tense and bitter atmosphere, Jedediah Thorne rode. He was a man in his late 20s, lean and weathered as old leather, with eyes the color of a stormy sky that seemed to miss nothing. He sat his sturdy buckskin gelding with an easy grace, but every movement he made was quiet and deliberate, an economy of motion learned in places where a wasted gesture could get a man killed. He led a pack mule carrying all his worldly possessions, which was not much. He looked like any other drifter, a cowboy searching for work. But Jed was also a man running from his own ghosts. A saloon in a dusty Texas town, a stupid argument over a card game, a loudmouthed kid with more pride than sense who had mistaken Jed's quiet nature for weakness. Jed had not wanted the fight. He had tried to walk away, but the kid had drawn on him, and Jed's hand had moved with an instinct he had honed over 1,000 miles of hard country. The gunfight was not his choosing, but it had ended with the kid lying dead in the sawdust, and the incident had left an indelible mark on Jed's soul. He did not seek trouble. He sought only anonymity, a place to work until his hands were raw and his body was too tired for his mind to torment him with echoes of the past. As he rode down the main street of redemption, he felt the town's oppressive energy settle on him like a shroud. He saw the suspicious glances from men lounging on wooden porches, the way curtains twitched in the windows of the clapboard houses. This was a town that did not welcome strangers. His first stop was the saloon, a dark, sour-smelling establishment called the Gilded Cage. He ordered a whiskey and stood at the bar, letting the burn of the liquor cut through the trail dust in his throat. He did not speak. He just listened. The talk was of cattle prices, the lack of rain, and then, in lower, harsher tones, of the girl out on the flats. Saw the witch girl down by the river again. A burly man with a stained beard muttered to his companion, "Gives me a chill just looking at her." "Brody ought to run her off for good," the other man grumbled. "Bad luck, that one. Mark my words." Jed took a slow sip of his whiskey, his face impassive. Witch girl. He filed the information away. His instincts, sharpened by a life of reading men and situations, told him there was a whole lot more to that story than just bitter gossip. He finished his drink, paid the bartender, and walked back out into the unforgiving sunlight, his mind already working. He secured a job the next morning at the R Ranch, a sprawling property a few miles north of town. The owner, a grizzled, no-nonsense rancher named Silas Croft, looked Jed up and down, his eyes shrewd. He asked Jed only 2 questions. "Can you ride?" and "Can you work?" When Jed answered yes to both, Silas hired him on the spot. Silas was a rare exception in redemption. He was a man who judged another by the sweat on his brow and the strength in his back, not by the wagging of tongues in town. He was as tough and unyielding as the land he worked, but there was a fairness to him that Jed recognized immediately. Silas gave Jed a bunk in the long, drafty bunkhouse and a list of duties that would have crippled a lesser man. The work was grueling, from sunup to sundown. He was tasked with helping to break a string of wild mustangs, their spirits as untamed as the country they came from. The days were a blur of dust, sweat, and the violent, jarring impact of horse against man. When he was not in the corral, he was out on the range, mending miles of fence line under the vast, empty sky. The work was exactly what he needed. It was physical, demanding, and left him so exhausted by nightfall that he collapsed onto his bunk and fell into a dreamless sleep, the ghosts in his head finally silenced by the ache in his muscles. The other hands were a typical mix. There were young, boisterous cowboys, full of cheap whiskey and big talk, and older, more cynical men who had seen too much and said too little. Jed kept to himself. He did his work without complaint, his quiet competence earning him a measure of grudging respect. He did not join their card games or their crude storytelling. He preferred the solitude of the open range, the quiet company of his horse. From the northern edge of the ranch property, atop a low rise, He could see a small cabin far in the distance, a lonely, insignificant speck against the immensity of the landscape. He knew it was hers, the witch girl's. He found himself watching it as he worked, a strange and unfamiliar protective instinct stirring deep within him. Their first encounter happened a few weeks later, on a day when the sky was a pale, washed-out blue and the sun beat down with a late summer intensity. Jed was riding the fence line that bordered the dusty track leading from the river back towards town, the same path Ilara had to use. He saw her in the distance, a solitary figure walking with her head down, her shoulders slumped in a posture of weary resilience. She was carrying 2 heavy wooden buckets of water, her arms strained with the effort. As she drew nearer, he reined in his horse and watched from the shade of a lone cottonwood. It was then that he saw the others. A group of 4 youths from town, none older than 17, rode out from a shallow ravine. They were emboldened by their numbers and the cruel confidence of boys who had never been properly challenged. They spurred their horses, circling her like coyotes around a wounded fawn, kicking up clouds of thick, choking dust. "Look what the river washed up!" one of them jeered, his voice cracking with adolescent bravado. "Hey, witch girl!" another shouted. "Cast any spells today?" Ilara stopped and stood her ground. Her face was pale, a stark contrast to the dark soil caking the hem of her dress, but her eyes, when she lifted her head, flashed with a defiant fire. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the bucket handles. She did not cry. She did not plead. She simply stood there and endured their torment, her silence a testament to a strength they could not comprehend. Her refusal to break seemed to infuriate them more. The lead boy nudged his horse closer, leaning down from his saddle as if to spit. Jed had seen enough. He did not want trouble. Trouble was what he had been riding away from for 2 years. But the casual, thoughtless cruelty of the scene dug at something deep inside him, something he thought he had buried long ago. He nudged the buckskin with his heels, urging the horse forward, not at a charge, but a slow, deliberate walk. He did not shout. He did not draw the Colt peacemaker that rested easy on his hip. He simply rode his horse directly into the circle of dust and stopped, positioning himself between Ilara and the boys. He did not look at her. His stormy gray eyes, cold and steady as river stones, were fixed on the youths. He said nothing. His silence was more intimidating than any threat. The youths, faced with this silent, imposing figure, this stranger whose gaze seemed to see right through their cheap bravado, faltered. The smirks slid from their faces. They muttered a few more half-hearted insults, avoiding his eyes, before the lead boy finally wheeled his horse around. The others followed suit, and they galloped away towards town, their laughter sounding forced and hollow on the wind. Jed dismounted, the soft thud of his boots on the hard-packed earth breaking the sudden silence. Ilara was trembling, not from cold, but from the adrenaline that was now draining away, leaving her weak and exposed. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and bewildered gratitude. She braced herself. She expected him to lecture her, to tell her she should not be out here alone. She expected him to pity her, his eyes full of the same condescending sympathy she saw in the pastor's wife. Or worse, she expected him to be like all the others, to look at her with suspicion, as if she had somehow invited the attack. He did none of those things. He simply looked at the buckets, then at her strained arms. He reached down, and his calloused fingers wrapped around the handle of the bucket in her right hand, taking its weight from her. "That's a long walk," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones tumbling in a dry creek bed. The simple, decent gesture was so unexpected it stole her breath. She could only nod, unable to find her voice. He fell into step beside her, carrying the one bucket, and they walked the rest of the way to her cabin in silence. It was not an awkward silence. It was a heavy silence, filled with the unspoken weight of 2 solitary lives that had, for a moment, intersected. It was a silence of shared solitude, a language they both understood better than words. When they reached the crude plank door of her cabin, he set the bucket down. His gaze swept over the small structure, taking in the details with a practiced eye. He saw the cracks in the chinking between the logs, the patches on the roof that would not hold against the first winter snow, the general air of disrepair that spoke of a desperate, lonely struggle. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time in over a year, she felt seen. He saw not the town's pariah, not the cursed witch girl of bitter gossip, but a young woman fighting a battle all by herself and against impossible odds. "You ought to have a well," he said, his gaze sweeping over the arid land that stretched between her cabin and the distant river. It was a practical observation, not a judgment, a simple statement of fact. She finally found her voice. It was soft, having gone unused for much of the day, but it was clear and steady. "Wells cost money." He nodded slowly, a flicker of something unreadable moving in the depths of his stormy eyes. Without another word, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell and turned to leave. He swung himself up into the saddle with fluid ease. "Watch yourself," he said over his shoulder. Then he was gone, riding away, a solitary figure diminishing against the vast, indifferent landscape. Elara stood in the doorway of her broken-down cabin, staring after him until he was just a speck on the horizon. The heavy bucket of water sat by her feet, a solid, tangible proof that he had been there, that it had not been a dream. A single, hairline crack of light had just pierced her suffocating darkness. That night, for the first time in a year, Elara did not dream of the ambush in the canyon, of the sound of gunfire and her mother's scream. She dreamed of a quiet, protective presence, of a pair of stormy gray eyes, and the impossible, solid warmth of a stranger's kindness. Days bled into weeks, and the season began to turn. The deep, vibrant greens of late summer surrendered, fading into the muted browns and tired ochres of autumn. The air grew sharper, carrying a crispness in the mornings that hinted at the coming cold, and the relentless Wyoming wind now carried the first bitter bite of winter. Under a vast, pale sky, the land seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Jedediah Thorne worked tirelessly at the Triple R Ranch, welcoming the profound ache in his bones at the end of each day. The physical exhaustion was a welcome anesthetic for his mind, a heavy blanket that smothered the restless ghosts of his past. He threw himself into the work, his movements precise and efficient, earning him a reputation among the other hands as a man who was all business. But in the quiet moments, when he was riding the long fence lines or staring into the flames of the bunkhouse stove, his thoughts would drift. They drifted south, across the rolling plains, to the lonely speck of a cabin and the girl who lived inside it. He could not seem to shake her from his mind, her pale face, the defiance in her eyes, the weary slump of her shoulders. It was all etched there as clearly as if it had been branded. He began to find reasons, however thin, to ride the southern fence line, the one that bordered the path to her home. He told himself he was checking for breaks in the wire, but he knew he was looking for a glimpse of her. He never approached her directly. A fragile, unspoken boundary existed between them, and he was careful not to cross it. He understood solitude, and he would not trespass on hers. Instead, he began a silent conversation. One morning, just as the sun was cresting the horizon, he left a brace of rabbits he had shot, cleaned and dressed, hanging from a fence post he knew she would pass on her way to the river. Another evening, under the cover of a deep twilight, he left a small, neatly tied bundle of firewood, thicker and drier than the scrub she was forced to gather. On his next trip into Redemption for supplies, he bought a small sack of flour and left it in the same spot. He never waited to be seen, never lingered for a word of thanks. He would leave his token and ride away, a strange tightness in his chest. He told himself it was just a simple kindness, what any decent person would do for another who was struggling. But he knew, in that quiet, honest part of his soul, that it was more than that. It was a way of reaching across the emptiness, a way of telling her that she was not completely, utterly alone in the world. Elara discovered these gifts with a sense of wonder that was quickly overwhelmed by a lifetime of caution. The first time she saw the rabbits, her heart leaped into her throat with fear. She was certain it was a trap, or worse, a cruel joke orchestrated by the boys from town, a prelude to some new torment. She circled the fence post for a long time, her eyes scanning the empty plains, before her hunger finally won out over her fear. She snatched the rabbits and ran back to her cabin, her door barred tight behind her. The firewood appeared 2 days later, and then the flour. They were not tricks. They were practical, life-sustaining things. They were gifts of survival. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, who they were from. The quiet cowboy with the stormy gray eyes. A cautious, fragile hope began to bloom in the barren soil of her heart. It was a feeling so foreign she barely recognized it, a delicate warmth that spread through her chest and brought a flush to her cheeks. She started looking for him. As she went about her lonely chores, her eyes would scan the horizon, searching for the distant silhouette of a man on a buckskin horse. One afternoon, as she was trying to mend the crude wooden fence around the small vegetable patch she had worked so hard to cultivate, he rode up. The sound of his horse's hooves made her jump, and she turned, a hand flying to her chest. He did not dismount immediately, but reined in his horse a few yards away. Watching her for a moment, she stood frozen, clutching a hammer in her hand, feeling exposed and vulnerable under his steady gaze. He saw the way she had used strips of leather and old rope to bind the splintered posts together. He saw her hands, chapped and raw from the work, but he also saw the determined set of her jaw. "Those posts will not hold against the winter winds," he stated. His voice was calm, a simple observation, not a criticism. A flush of shame and defiance rose on her cheeks. She lifted her chin. "It is all I have," she replied, her voice stronger than she felt. He swung down from his horse in one fluid motion. The leather of his saddle creaked, a sound that seemed loud in the immense quiet. "I have some tools at the ranch. Some spare lumber Silas will not miss." He did not ask for her permission. He presented it as an accomplished fact. He returned an hour later, his pack mule loaded with a post-hole digger, a saw, and several sturdy lengths of cured timber. For the next several hours, they worked together. They did not talk much, but a comfortable, easy rhythm developed between them. He showed her how to dig the holes deep, how to set a post so it would stand firm against the unrelenting force of the wind. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements sure and economical. She watched his capable hands, the way they handled the tools with an ingrained familiarity, and felt a sense of safety she had not known since her father was alive. In the shared moments of their labor, in the simple, honest sweat of their work, the invisible walls between them began to crumble. Their conversations started hesitantly in the days that followed. He would ride by the new sturdy fence line, and they would talk. The topics were safe, shallow pools that circled the deep, dark well of pain that lay within each of them. He asked about her garden, what she planned to grow next year. She asked about his buckskin horse, his name and temperament. They spoke of the weather, the changing seasons, the migration of the geese that passed high overhead. But as the days grew shorter and the air grew colder, their talks became longer, more intimate. The fence line became their neutral territory, a place between her world of isolation and his world of restless wandering. One evening, as a fiery sunset bled across the clouds, painting the sky in brilliant, heartbreaking colors, she found the courage to ask a question that had been weighing on her mind. "Where do you come from, Jedediah?" she asked, her voice soft. He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant, purple shadows of the mountains. The wind tugged at the brim of his hat. "A place I cannot go back to," he finally said, and his voice was laced with a profound and bottomless sadness. He did not offer any details, but the weight of his words, the bleak finality in his tone, told her enough. She understood the language of regret. She knew what it was to be haunted by a place you could never see again. In turn, she found herself speaking of her family. It was the first time she had spoken of them to anyone, and strangely, She did not speak of their deaths. She spoke of their lives. She told him about her father's laugh, a great booming sound that could make the tin plates rattle on the shelf. She told him about her mother's songs, old lullabies from a country across the sea, which she would sing while kneading bread. She told him about her little brother, Samuel, and his fascination with the stars, how he had believed each one was a window into heaven. As she spoke, the memories, for the first time, were not just jagged shards of pain. They became treasures, precious things she could hold up to the light and share with someone. Jed listened intently, his stormy eyes never leaving her face. He did not offer pity. He did not offer judgment. He just listened, his quiet presence a steady anchor in the swirling storm of her grief. The first major emotional climax of their fragile, budding connection arrived with the full, savage force of nature. An early blizzard descended upon the plains with a shocking and terrifying speed. One moment, the sky was a sheet of dull gray. The next, it was a roiling, churning wall of white that erased the horizon and turned the entire world into a howling vortex of snow and ice. Ilara was caught out in it. She had wandered farther from her cabin than she should have, checking her line of snares, her mind distracted by thoughts of Jed. The temperature plummeted with breathtaking speed, and the wind, a shrieking demon, drove the snow into her face with the force of thrown sand, blinding her. Disoriented, she turned back towards her cabin, but she could see nothing. The landscape she knew so intimately was gone, replaced by a chaotic, featureless maelstrom. She struggled onward, her thin coat offering little protection against the penetrating cold, her every breath a painful gasp of frigid air. At the ranch, the cowboys rushed to get the last of the herd into the shelter of the valley. Jed worked with a frantic energy, his face wrapped in a scarf against the stinging ice particles. But as the full fury of the storm broke over them, his first and only thought was of her, Ilara. He pictured her small, drafty cabin, her likely meager supply of firewood. An overwhelming sense of dread, cold and sharp as the wind itself, gripped him. "You are not thinking of going out in this?" Silas Croft yelled over the roar of the storm as Jed began saddling the buckskin. "It is suicide, son." "I have to," Jed yelled back, his jaw set. He did not explain. He did not need to. The old rancher saw the look in his eyes and simply shook his head, a grim understanding passing between them. Jed pulled his hat low, wrapped the scarf tighter around his face, and rode out into the teeth of the blizzard. The world was a blinding, howling whiteness. He could not see more than a few feet in front of him. He gave the horse its head, trusting its instincts as much as his own, and followed the memory of the southern fence line. He was not guided by sight, but by a primal, desperate need to find her, a force more powerful than the storm itself. He found her collapsed in the snow, a small, dark shape in the endless white, no more than a few hundred yards from her cabin. She was barely conscious, her body already succumbing to the lethal, insidious cold. He leaped from his horse, his heart pounding with a terror he had not felt since the gunfight in Texas. He scooped her into his arms. She felt terrifyingly light, as fragile as a bird. He carried her the remaining distance, his own body shielding hers from the wind, his boots sinking deep into the rapidly accumulating drifts. The cabin was frigid, the air inside almost as cold as it was outside. He kicked the door open with his boot, strode across the small room, and laid her gently on her narrow cot. He set to work with a desperate urgency. He stuffed old rags into the cracks in the walls, trying to block the whistling drafts. He took his own heavy bedroll from his saddle and spread it over her thin blankets. He used the last of his kindling and the few pieces of wood by her hearth to coax a desperate, sputtering fire to life. He looked at her, lying so still on the cot, her skin a waxy, bluish white. Her clothes were frozen, stiff with ice, with a clinical focus, his mind blocking out everything but the single, consuming goal of saving her life. He stripped off her wet, frozen dress and underthings. He wrapped her shivering, almost lifeless body in every blanket he could find, piling them on top of her. He chafed her hands and feet, trying to force life back into them. It was not enough. She was still so cold, her shivering growing weaker. A dangerous sign. He knew, with a terrible certainty, what he had to do. He shed his own heavy coat and boots, lifted the layers of blankets, and lay down on the narrow cot beside her, pulling her small, cold body against his own, wrapping his arms around her to share his warmth. Hours passed. The blizzard raged outside, a wild symphony of chaos, but inside the small cabin, there was a profound and absolute stillness. The only sounds were the crackle of the small fire and the soft whisper of two people breathing. Ilara slowly drifted back to consciousness. She was not aware of the biting cold or the howling wind, but of a steady, encompassing warmth that seemed to soak right into her bones. She felt the solidness of a body against hers, the slow, rhythmic beat of a heart against her back. A flicker of fear went through her, but it was instantly replaced by an overwhelming, inexplicable sense of safety. She knew it was him. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply lay there, soaking in the life-saving heat, feeling the life flow back into her. In this moment of extreme vulnerability, all pretense was stripped away. They were not the town outcast and the drifting cowboy. They were just two people, clinging to each other for survival against the vast, indifferent cruelty of nature. As the fire crackled and the storm howled its fury against the thin wooden walls, Jed held her, his mind quiet for the first time in years. He was no longer running from his past. He was anchored, firmly, in the present. His purpose had become singular and startlingly clear: to protect the woman he held in his arms. The intimacy of the moment was not born of passion, but of something far deeper, a desperate, primal connection forged in the heart of the storm. It was the moment their fragile bond solidified into something unbreakable. They were no longer just a lonely woman and a drifting cowboy. In the heart of that savage blizzard, they had become two halves of a whole, finding shelter not just from the storm, but in each other. The blizzard broke after 2 long days and nights of howling fury. It did not end so much as it simply exhausted itself, leaving the world transformed, buried under a thick and pristine blanket of white. The silence that followed the storm was absolute, a profound and ringing quiet broken only by the soft, rhythmic drip of melting snow from the cabin's eaves. Inside, a fragile warmth had settled, a small pocket of life held safe against the vast, frozen landscape. Jed had not left Ilara's side. For 2 days, he had been a constant, watchful presence. He kept the small fire fed with the wood he had brought, its cheerful crackle a defiant sound against the storm's roar. He melted snow in her small cookpot for water and shared the meager rations of jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags. He watched as the color slowly returned to her cheeks and the light of awareness returned to her eyes. As her strength came back, a new and shy intimacy bloomed between them in the confines of the small cabin. They were suspended in time, the world outside erased by the snow, leaving only the two of them. They talked for hours, their voices low and soft in the quiet space. The harrowing brush with death had stripped away their final reserves, leaving their souls bare and undefended. There were no more walls to hide behind. In the flickering firelight, Jed told her about the ghost that had chased him across the country. He spoke of a dusty saloon in Texas, of a stupid argument over a card game that should have ended with nothing more than angry words. He told her about the young man, full of liquor and foolish pride, who would not let it go. He described the moment the man's hand had dropped to his gun, and how his own had moved on pure, terrible instinct. He spoke of the dead man's face, an image of shocked surprise seared into his memory, and of the suffocating guilt that had been his constant companion ever since. He had not been running from the law, he had been running from himself. Ilara listened, her heart aching with a deep and painful empathy for the burden he carried. When he finished, his voice trailing off into the crackling silence, she saw the shame and self-loathing that shadowed his eyes. Without a word, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were small and cool against his calloused palm. It was not a gesture of pity, but of profound and unconditional acceptance, an absolution he had long since denied himself. He looked at their joined hands, then into her eyes, and saw not a judge, but a fellow survivor who understood the weight of a past that could not be changed. In that small, snowbound cabin, a space of shared vulnerability became a sanctuary. Their feelings for each other, which had grown in silent gestures and hesitant conversations, deepened into a quiet certainty. It was a love born not in sunshine and laughter, but in shadow and hardship, a love that was profound, elemental, and as desperately needed as the warmth of the fire that kept the deadly cold at bay. Their newfound peace, however, was a fragile bubble, destined to be burst by the harsh realities of the world that lay waiting for them under the snow. When the drifts had melted enough for travel, Jed knew he had to return to the RRR. He left Alara with his remaining food and a promise to return soon, a promise that hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Silas Croft greeted him at the ranch gate with an expression that was a mixture of profound relief and stern disapproval. The old rancher's face was a roadmap of worry. "I thought the storm had taken you, son," he said, his voice a low grumble. "A fool thing to do, riding out in that." Jed dismounted, his body stiff and tired. "I had to," he said simply. He explained what had happened, how he had found Alara near death and brought her back. As he spoke, the hard lines of the old rancher's face softened. Silas had seen the change in Jed over the past weeks, had noticed the easing of the haunted, restless look in his eyes. He looked at the young man now, and he understood. He just grunted and clapped Jed on the shoulder. "Well, get some food in you. You look half-starved." But Redemption was a town that thrived on whispers, and news of the strange cowboy spending 2 days and nights snowed in with the town outcast traveled as fast as a prairie fire. The gossip mill, which had been grinding away at Alara for a year, now churned with renewed and vicious energy. The whispers against her now included Jed, tainting him by an association the townsfolk considered scandalous. He was no longer just a quiet stranger. He was the witch girl's consort, a man of questionable character who consorted with bad luck. Sheriff Brody heard the talk, and it displeased him. Brody's authority in Redemption was built on maintaining the town's rigid social order, on nurturing its fears and prejudices. Jed, with his quiet defiance and his protection of the girl who should have remained a powerless pariah, was a threat. But Brody's dislike was rooted in something far deeper and darker than mere prejudice. He had a vested, secret interest in keeping Alara Hayes isolated, afraid, and utterly alone. The source of that secret was hiding out in the remote, labyrinthine canyons north of town, a place where the law never ventured. A gang of outlaws, led by a ruthless, black-hearted man named Finn, had made the canyons their personal kingdom. They were the same men who had murdered Alara's family. They had a profitable and long-standing arrangement with Sheriff Brody. For a generous share of their loot from robbed stagecoaches and payrolls, the sheriff kept any inquisitive lawmen away from their activities and funneled them useful information. It was Brody who told Finn that the Hayes girl was not only still alive, but had found herself a protector. The news did not sit well with Finn. He was not a man who liked loose ends. He saw Alara not as a traumatized young woman, but as a living witness, a loose thread that, if pulled, could unravel his entire profitable operation. He decided it was time to cut that thread for good. Brody, his own neck on the line and fearing exposure more than anything, readily agreed. He gave Finn the information he needed, the location of the isolated cabin, the fact that the girl was alone, and the habits of the lone cowboy who seemed to be her guardian. The attack came on a moonless night. A sliver of a new moon hung in the inky black sky, offering no light to the world below. Alara was sitting by her small hearth, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. In her hands, she was mending a tear in one of Jed's shirts, which he had left behind. The simple, domestic act filled her with a quiet, unfamiliar joy. For the first time in over a year, she felt a flicker of real hope, a belief that a different kind of life might be possible. Suddenly, the scruffy stray dog she had taken in a month prior, a creature as lonely as herself, leaped to its feet, the fur on its neck bristling as it let out a frantic, guttural bark. Before Alara could even process the warning, a heavy boot slammed against her door, kicking it in with a sound of splintering, shattering wood. 3 figures burst into the cabin, framed against the blackness of the night. Their faces were cruel, predatory masks in the firelight, their eyes devoid of mercy or compassion. Alara's blood ran cold. The mending fell from her hands. She recognized them instantly. It was a recognition that came not from her mind, but from the deepest, most terrified part of her soul. The same dead eyes, the same sneering mouths from her nightmares. The trauma of the last year hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs and turning her limbs to stone. She was paralyzed, frozen in the exact same heart-stopping terror she had felt as a girl hiding in the rocks, listening to the sounds of her family dying. Miles away, Jed was riding back from the ranch. He had been possessed by a cold knot of dread in his stomach that he could not shake all day. A deep, primal instinct screamed at him that something was wrong. He had tried to dismiss it as foolishness, but the feeling only grew stronger. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he had saddled the buckskin and told Silas he was going for a ride. He told himself he was just being overcautious, that he just needed to see for himself that she was all right. As he topped the last rise that overlooked the flatlands where her cabin stood, he saw it. It was not the familiar, welcoming speck of candlelight he had come to look for, but a flickering, unnatural orange glow against the deep darkness, a hungry light that writhed and leaped into the night sky. It was her cabin. It was on fire. A primal roar of pure fury and animal fear erupted from his chest, a sound torn from the very depths of his being. He dug his spurs viciously into the buckskin's flanks, pushing the animal to a frantic, reckless gallop. The world narrowed to a single, horrifying point, the burning cabin and the woman trapped inside. He arrived to a scene from hell. Flames were consuming the small wooden structure, roaring into the night sky like a beast unleashed, sending a shower of sparks and embers up towards the pitiless stars. In the demonic, flickering light of the blaze, he saw 2 men dragging a struggling Alara out of the inferno, their intent brutally clear. A third man, Finn, stood watching, a pistol in his hand. Jed did not hesitate. He did not slow his horse. As he galloped into the circle of firelight, he drew his Colt Peacemaker. The first shot was fired before his feet even hit the ground, the bullet finding its mark in one of the men holding Alara. The man grunted in surprise and collapsed, his grip on her loosening. The other 2 turned, startled by the sudden, violent arrival. The world exploded into a chaotic flurry of sound. The deafening roar of gunfire, the panicked shouts of men, and the hungry roar of the fire. Jed moved with a deadly, focused grace. All his past regrets, all his pain, all the violence he had tried to run from was now channeled into a singular, lethal purpose. He was no longer the reluctant gunslinger, haunted by the past. He was a man defending the only thing that mattered to him in the world. He fired again, and the second man spun around and fell. Finn, seeing his men go down, shoved Alara violently to the ground and used her body as a shield, firing his own pistol at Jed. The firelight illuminated the savage desperation on their faces. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Jed's shirt, the graze a searing line of pain along his arm. He ignored it. He leveled his Colt, his aim steady and true, and fired. Finn stumbled backward, his hand clutching his chest, a look of profound shock on his face before he crumpled to the dirt. The silence that followed was as shocking as the violence had been. Jed rushed to Alara's side. She was on the ground, gasping for air, her body trembling uncontrollably. Just then, the roof of the cabin, its main support beam finally eaten through by the flames, collapsed inward with a great, whooshing groan, sending a geyser of sparks and embers into the night. He pulled her away from the intense heat, his hands moving over her, checking for injuries. She had a nasty burn on her forearm where an ember had landed, and a bleeding gash on her forehead where she must have hit her head when Finn threw her down. But she was alive. He pulled her close, his entire body shaking with the violent aftershock of the fight. He held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her mixed with the acrid, choking smoke. He had saved her. But the cost was immense. The fire had taken everything, the small cabin and all the meager possessions that had made up her world. And the brutal, violent confrontation had ripped open the deep, unhealed wounds of her past, pouring salt and fire into them. She began to sob in his arms, but they were not tears of relief. They were the racking, broken sobs of sheer, abject terror. The horror of her past and the horror of her present had crashed together in one devastating, overwhelming wave. The quiet, romantic haven they had just begun to build together had been literally burned to the ground, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. Two scarred and desperate souls under the cold, pitiless stars. The immediate aftermath of the gunfight was a chaotic blur of smoke, fear, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood in the air. The roaring fire was a living, breathing monster, consuming what was left of Ilara's life and casting a hellish, dancing light on the scene of brutal violence. The bodies of the outlaws lay twisted and still in the dirt, their final moments of cruelty etched onto their faces. The night, which a moment ago had been silent, was now filled with the crackle and pop of burning timber and the ragged sound of two people gasping for air. Jed's mind worked with a cold, sharp clarity that cut through the adrenaline. His first and only priority was Ilara, but a close second was the certain knowledge that Sheriff Brody would be coming. He would not be coming to investigate a crime or to render aid. He would be coming to control the narrative, to bury his own dark secrets along with the bodies of his dead accomplices. They could not be found here. To be found here would be a death sentence, either at the end of a rope after a sham trial or from a bullet in the back while resisting arrest. He turned to Ilara. She was in a state of profound shock, her body trembling violently, her eyes wide, vacant, and fixed on the flames that had been her home. The gash on her forehead oozed a thin line of blood down her temple, and the burn on her arm was an angry red blister against her pale skin. She did not seem to see him or to feel the arm he had wrapped around her shoulders. She was lost, adrift in a sea of horror. "Ilara," he said, his voice low and urgent, "we have to go, now." She did not respond. He gently took her by the shoulders and turned her away from the fire, but her gaze remained distant, unfocused. She barely registered his touch. With a curse under his breath, he scooped her gently into his arms. She was so light, a fragile weight against his chest. He carried her to his buckskin, which stood nervously at the edge of the firelight, its eyes wide and its ears twitching. He placed her on the saddle, her body slumping forward like a rag doll's, and swung up behind her. He wrapped his arms securely around her, pulling her back against his chest as if he could physically shield her from the trauma that had just shattered her world. He gathered the reins, his grazed arm throbbing with a dull, insistent pain, and guided the horse not towards the distant, treacherous lights of redemption or the familiar safety of the Triple R, but towards the dark, looming silhouette of the mountains that rose against the star-dusted sky. It was the one place he knew they could disappear. Their refuge was a place Jed had discovered during his solitary explorations on the ranch's periphery, a hidden line shack nestled deep within a secluded mountain canyon. It was used by ranchers during the summer months for grazing cattle in the high country, but was always abandoned once the colder months set in. The shack was small and crude, little more than a box of rough-hewn logs, but it had 4 solid walls, a roof that was mostly intact, and a stone fireplace that promised warmth and life. The journey there was an arduous ordeal. As they climbed higher, leaving the open plains below, the air grew thin and cold, biting at their exposed skin. The trail was a narrow, treacherous track, little more than a game path that wound its way through dense stands of pine and across fields of sharp, broken rock. Jed let the buckskin pick its own way through the darkness, the horse's instincts far more reliable than his own eyes in the gloom. Ilara remained mostly unresponsive, a silent, trembling weight in his arms, She was lost in the labyrinth of her own horror, her mind replaying the terror of the attack, the faces of the men, the splintering of her door. Jed's arm throbbed with a fiery pain from the gunshot graze, a constant, nagging reminder of the violence they had just escaped. He ignored it, his focus entirely on the woman he held and the difficult path ahead. He talked to her the whole way, his voice a low, steady murmur against her ear, a constant stream of reassurance in the vast, intimidating silence of the mountains. "We are safe now, Ilara," he would whisper. "I am with you. I will not let anything happen to you. Just hold on." He was not sure if she heard him, if his words were penetrating the thick fog of her shock, but he could not stand the silence. His voice was an anchor, for her and for him, a small human sound against the immense, indifferent wilderness. When they finally reached the shack, hours later, the first pale hint of dawn was bruising the eastern sky. He dismounted carefully, his weary muscles protesting, and lifted her down. He carried her inside and laid her on the simple rope bed that was the shack's only piece of furniture. The air inside was stale and freezing cold. His first task was to start a fire. With numb fingers, he used his flint and steel to spark a flame in the stone fireplace, nurturing it with dry tinder he found in a small wood box until it caught and grew into a steady, life-giving blaze. The flickering orange light pushed back the oppressive darkness, revealing the stark, bare interior of their sanctuary. He then turned his attention to her wounds. He gently washed the gash on her forehead with water from his canteen and a clean strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. He applied a salve from a small tin in his saddlebag, his touch as careful and reverent as a prayer. He did the same for the burn on her arm, his movements slow and deliberate. She did not flinch or make a sound, but a single tear traced a path through the soot on her cheek. For the next several days, Ilara was trapped in a waking nightmare. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was a flat, lifeless whisper. She existed in a state of suspended terror, her body in the mountain shack but her mind still in the burning cabin. She flinched at the slightest loud noise, a log shifting in the fire, the cry of a distant hawk, the wind whistling through the cracks in the log walls. She would jump at sudden movements, her eyes wide with a wild, cornered animal fear. Sleep offered no escape. It was a dark, treacherous country that brought with it horrific nightmares. They left her screaming in the night, thrashing against unseen assailants, her hands flailing to ward off blows only she could feel. In her dreams, she relived the murder of her family, the sounds and the smells as vivid as if they were happening all over again. She saw Finn's dead eyes, smelled the acrid smoke of the fire, felt the paralyzing, suffocating terror of her own helplessness. During these episodes, Jed was a constant, patient presence. He would wake instantly at her first cry and go to her, holding her by the shoulders, speaking to her softly, his voice a calm and steady anchor in the storm of her trauma. "You are safe, Ilara. It was just a dream. You are here with me." He would hold her, sometimes for hours, as the violent trembling subsided, and she would ride out the terrifying aftershocks of her nightmares with him by her side. During the days, he created a quiet routine, a small island of order in their sea of chaos. He hunted for food, his colt peacemaker providing them with rabbit and squirrel. He kept the fire roaring, its warmth a constant battle against the encroaching mountain cold. He made sure she was warm and safe, wrapping her in his bedroll, bringing her broth he had made from the game he caught. But he watched, with a growing sense of helpless frustration, as she seemed to drift further and further away from him. She was retreating into a place of deep pain, a place walled off by grief and terror, a place where he could not follow. She began to see herself as a curse, a human magnet for tragedy and death. A terrible, self-destructive logic took root in her traumatized mind. Her parents, her brother, everyone she had ever cared about had been violently taken from her. Now, this kind, quiet man had entered her life, and he had been shot. His life put in mortal danger, all because of her. She began to believe that she was a blight, that her very presence put him in danger, and that his proximity to her would only lead to his own destruction. The town had called her a curse, and now, in the depths of her despair, she was starting to believe them. The emotional climax of her descent and the true heart of their story arrived on a night when the world outside was bathed in the ethereal, silver light of a full moon. The snow on the high mountain peaks glowed with an otherworldly brilliance, and the stars were sharp and cold in the black sky. Ilara awoke from another nightmare with a strangled gasp, her body drenched in a cold sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jed was there in an instant, reaching for her as he always did. But this time, she scrambled away from him, crab-walking backward on the rough wooden floor until her back hit the cold logs of the far wall. Her eyes were wild with fear and a terrible, heartbreaking certainty. "Do not," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken sound. "You have to leave me. You have to go." Jed stopped, his hand still outstretched, confusion and hurt clouding his face. "Ilara, what is it?" "Can you not see?" she cried, her voice rising with a frantic hysteria. "I bring death. I bring ruin. My family. They are dead because of me. The cabin, burned. Now you were shot. They will hunt you because of me. They will not stop." She was trying to push him away, to save him from the contagion of her own tragic life by sacrificing herself to the loneliness she now believed was her unalterable destiny. Her movements became frantic. She scrambled to her feet and stumbled towards the door, her hands fumbling with the wooden latch. She was intent on running out into the freezing night, to go anywhere, to simply disappear so that he could be safe. Jed moved quickly, crossing the small room in 2 long strides and catching her at the doorway. He took her gently by the arms, his grip firm but not harsh, and turned her to face him. The cold night air swirled around them, carrying the clean, sharp scent of pine and snow. The brilliant moonlight streamed into the cabin, illuminating the tears that were streaming down her face, each one a silver track of pure despair. She struggled weakly against his grip, her small fists beating ineffectually against his chest. "Let me go," she begged, her voice choked with sobs. "Please, Jedediah, just let me go. Run from me. Save yourself." His heart broke at her words, at the sheer depth of her self-loathing and despair. With a raw sound of pain, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest as her body was racked with violent trembles. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, his own eyes burning. "No," he said, his voice thick with an emotion so powerful it was almost a physical thing, but it was unwavering. "I am not running. Not from you. Not ever." He held her there, just inside the doorway, beneath the silent, watching mountain moon, simply letting her feel the unshakable strength and certainty of his presence. He held her as her struggles weakened and her sobs quieted into ragged, exhausted gasps. "Do not run from me," she pleaded again, her words muffled against the rough fabric of his shirt. Her meaning was twisted by her terror, a desperate plea for him to save himself from her. But he heard the true plea that lay buried beneath it, the terrified, unspoken cry of her heart, "Do not leave me." He held her tighter, his arms a circle of absolute commitment. "Listen to me, Ilara," he said, his voice a raw and solemn vow in the vast, cold silence of the mountains. "Your life is not a curse. It is a miracle. You survived, you fought, and you will not face the rest of it alone. I am here. Do you hear me? Whatever comes, we face it together." He led her back inside, away from the cold, and gently guided her to sit on the floor by the warm hearth. He sat beside her, his arms still wrapped around her, and held her as her trembling finally subsided, replaced by a deep, shuddering exhaustion. In this moment, under the brilliant light of the mountain moon, their love was truly forged. It was not a gentle, easy love born of comfort and peace. It was a fierce, protective, and desperate bond born of shared trauma and a stubborn, mutual refusal to surrender to the darkness. He had not just saved her from the cold or from the outlaws. He had stood with her at the very edge of her own despair and had refused to let her fall. He had shown her, in the only way that mattered, that she was not a curse to be fled from, but a woman worthy of being fought for. For Ilara, his steadfastness was the only anchor in the raging storm of her trauma, the one solid thing she could hold on to in a world that had been ripped apart. For Jed, protecting her, loving her, had finally given him a reason to stop running from his own past. It had given him a reason to stand his ground and fight for a future. It was a moment of profound emotional catharsis, a single, unbreakable glimmer of hope shining brightly in the midst of their dark and devastating tragedy. In the quiet sanctuary of the mountain shack, a subtle but profound shift occurred. The raw, desperate clinging of survival, the way they had held on to each other through the storm and the fire, began to transform into something stronger, a partnership built on a foundation of shared resolve. The days were marked by a gentle, healing rhythm, dictated by the rising and setting of the sun over the high peaks. Ilara, anchored by Jed's unwavering, quiet support, began to mend. The nightmares still came, stalking the edges of her sleep, but they were less frequent now, their sharp, terrifying edges softened by the certain knowledge that she would not wake up alone. The gash on her forehead faded to a thin, pale scar, and the burn on her arm healed, leaving behind a permanent, puckered mark on her skin. But as her physical wounds closed, a new kind of strength began to take root in her spirit. It was not the brittle, passive resilience of a victim enduring her fate, but the burgeoning, formidable power of a survivor who was choosing, finally, to fight back. She began to see the world differently. The outlaws, Sheriff Brody, the town's cruel prejudice, they were not a personal curse she was destined to carry. They were an injustice, a sickness in the land that had to be confronted. Her deep, bottomless grief for her family, a weight that had threatened to drown her for so long, began to transmute into something else. It became a quiet, burning anger, a righteous fire that demanded not just survival, but accountability. She no longer wanted to be just protected. She wanted to be part of the solution. She wanted to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Jed saw the change in her, saw the fire replacing the fear in her eyes, and he did everything he could to nurture it. One clear, cold afternoon, in the secluded meadow behind the shack, he unbuckled his gun belt and held out the heavy Colt Peacemaker to her. "It is time you learned," he said simply. The first time she held the weapon, its cold, heavy steel resting in her palms, her hands trembled uncontrollably. The memory of gunfire, of its deafening roar and deadly purpose, was still raw and terrifying. She wanted to drop it, to run from the very thing that had destroyed her family. But Jed was a patient teacher. He stood behind her, his presence a warm and steadying force. His hands gently guided hers, showing her how to wrap her fingers around the grip, how to find the balance of the weapon. He showed her how to stand, her feet planted firmly on the earth. He showed her how to lift the gun, to align the sights, to control her breathing until the world narrowed to the target, a knot on a distant pine tree. "It is just a tool, Ilara," he told her, his voice a low murmur near her ear, like a hammer or an axe. "It is the intent behind it that matters. For us, this is not about vengeance. It is about not having to be afraid anymore." Practicing day after day in the privacy of their mountain canyon, Ilara slowly became proficient. The first time she pulled the trigger, the recoil jarring her shoulder. She flinched and closed her eyes. But she did not drop the gun. She fired again, and then again. The act of mastering the weapon was profoundly empowering. It was a tangible way of reclaiming control over her life, of facing her fear and bending it to her will. They were no longer just hiding in the mountains. They were preparing. During this time, their romantic bond deepened into something quiet and unbreakable. The long days of preparation were punctuated by moments of intense, peaceful intimacy. They would share a simple meal of roasted rabbit that he had cooked over the fire, sitting close together as the flames danced. They would watch the sunset paint the high, snowy peaks in shades of rose and gold, a sight of such breathtaking beauty it felt like a promise. They would talk late into the night, their voices low, sharing stories and dreams in the flickering firelight. Their desire for each other was not just a physical passion, though that was there too, a fierce and tender current that ran between them. It was an emotional connection, a desperate and fierce affirmation of life in the face of so much death. Jed knew, however, that they could not hide in the mountains forever. The changing colors of the aspen trees on the lower slopes were a constant reminder that winter was coming in earnest, and it would make their refuge an icy prison. More than that, he knew that true freedom would not be found in hiding. Justice, however imperfect, required them to return to the world that had cast them out. He began to formulate a plan, not one of reckless, suicidal vengeance, but a calculated and dangerous strategy to expose Sheriff Brody for the corrupt, hollow man he was. He knew that a direct accusation from an outcast girl and a wandering cowboy would be dismissed out of hand. He needed proof, cold, hard, and undeniable. Leaving Alara in the relative safety of the shack, with the dog for a companion and the colt for protection, he started making careful, clandestine trips down from the high country to the outskirts of Redemption. He moved like a ghost, using his skills as a tracker and his intimate knowledge of the wilderness to remain unseen. He would travel by night, resting during the day in hidden ravines or thick stands of timber. He began to watch Sheriff Brody, studying his routines from a distance, looking for a weakness, a crack in his armor of authority. He soon learned that twice a week, Brody would ride out of town alone, heading north. Jed followed him and discovered his destination, a remote, abandoned way station, a crumbling adobe ruin where the sheriff secretly met with the 3 remaining members of Finn's gang to exchange information and money. Jed knew he could not do this alone. To bring Brody down, he needed an ally within the town, someone with a voice and a reputation that people would have to listen to. His thoughts immediately turned to Silas Croft. The gruff, honest rancher was the only man in Redemption who had shown him a shred of decency. He approached Silas with extreme caution, sending a signal via a carefully placed stone on a fence post he knew the rancher checked daily. They met on a remote stretch of the R property, far from any prying eyes. In the shade of a towering rock formation, Jed told the old man everything. He told him about the attack on the cabin, about Finn and his men, and about Alara's unwavering certainty that they were the same men who had murdered her family. He told Silas about his suspicions of Brody and what he had observed at the old way station. Silas listened, his weathered face impassive, his shrewd eyes never leaving Jed's. He was a man who trusted his gut, and he had known for years that something about Brody was not right. He had seen the fear the sheriff instilled in the townsfolk, the way he preyed on their worst instincts and stoked their prejudices to maintain his own power. Seeing the cold, hard conviction in Jed's eyes and hearing the story of what Alara had endured, the old rancher's jaw tightened. "I believe you, son," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "Always thought Brody had the soul of a snake." He agreed to help. He had influence in the territory and a reputation for unbending honesty that even his enemies had to respect. Then he revealed a critical piece of information. "One of my younger ranch hands, a good boy named Billy Parker, has a brother who wears a deputy's star. Caleb is his name. The boy is terrified of Brody, but from what Billy tells me, he has a conscience and chafes under the sheriff's thumb. He might be the key to unlocking all of this." The tension escalated as Jed's quiet investigation began to tighten the net. In Redemption, Sheriff Brody, unnerved by the fact that neither Jed's nor Alara's bodies had been found in the ashes of the cabin, grew increasingly paranoid. He could not afford to have a living witness and a gunslinger with a grudge roaming the territory. He decided to act first. He put a substantial bounty on Jed's head, framing him as a dangerous outlaw who had brutally murdered Finn's men in a dispute over stolen goods and then kidnapped the Hayes girl. Crude, hand-drawn wanted posters, bearing a rough sketch of Jed's face, appeared all over town and were sent out to neighboring territories. Now Jed was not just an outsider, he was a hunted man. This raised the stakes of his mission immensely. Every trip down from the mountains, every moment spent observing Brody, was now a life-threatening risk. The danger became terrifyingly real one evening while he was hidden in the rocks overlooking the way station. A patrol of Brody's deputies, riding wide, nearly stumbled upon his position. A tense cat-and-mouse game ensued through the rocky, moon-drenched landscape. Jed used his knowledge of the terrain to evade them, doubling back, using shadows and gullies to his advantage. The pursuit ended in a desperate, close-quarters, non-lethal fight where Jed had to knock one of the deputies unconscious with the butt of his pistol to escape back into the darkness. He returned to the mountain shack that night with a fresh cut on his cheek and the grim knowledge that their time was running out. The turning point came a week later. Silas, using the young ranch hand Billy as a go-between, managed to arrange a secret meeting with Deputy Caleb Parker. The meeting was set for midnight at an old, abandoned church on the edge of the plains, a skeletal ruin whose steeple stood like a lonely finger pointing at the stars. Jed met Caleb inside the collapsing structure, where the moonlight streamed through the empty window frames, casting long, distorted shadows on the dusty floor. The young deputy was visibly terrified, his hands trembling, his eyes darting nervously towards every sound. It was clear his conscience was at war with his deep-seated fear of Sheriff Brody. Jed did not threaten or pressure him. Instead, he spoke quietly to the young man's sense of duty, to the ideals that must have made him pin on a lawman's badge in the first place. "I am not asking you to be a hero," Jed said, his voice low and even. "I am just asking you to be a lawman, to stand up for what is right, for an innocent family that was murdered in cold blood." As he spoke, a figure emerged from the deeper shadows at the back of the ruined church. It was Alara. She had insisted on being part of this, her voice firm when she told Jed, "This is my fight, too. He needs to hear it from me." She stood before the young deputy, not as a victim, but as a witness. Her voice was quiet but unnervingly strong, filled with a conviction that was more powerful than any threat. She told Caleb her story, her words simple, direct, and devastating. She described the faces of the men who had killed her family, the faces she saw every night in her dreams. And then she delivered the final, damning piece of testimony. "A few days before my family was killed," she said, her gaze locked on Caleb's, "I saw those same men, Finn and his partners, drinking in the saloon in Redemption. They were sitting with Sheriff Brody. They were laughing together." Her words hung in the silent, sacred space of the ruined church. For Caleb, her testimony was the final push that toppled his wall of fear. The color drained from his face, but a new, steely resolve entered his eyes. He agreed to help. "He keeps a ledger," Caleb whispered, his voice hoarse. "A secret one. I saw it once when he was drunk. It is hidden beneath a loose floorboard under his desk. It has everything in it. Names, dates, payments from Finn's gang. It is the proof you need." He then told them that Brody was scheduled to ride to a neighboring county in 2 days' time to transport a prisoner. He would be gone overnight, giving them a small, precious window of opportunity. The plan was set, a desperate, dangerous gamble that could change everything. They would break into the sheriff's office and steal the ledger. It was a single, decisive act that would either bring a corrupt man to justice or get them all killed. The night of the planned break-in was cold and sharp, the stars scattered across the immense black sky like chips of ice. A palpable, nervous energy hung over the town of Redemption, a taut silence that felt heavier than any sound. At the desolate edge of town, where the last of the ramshackle buildings gave way to the open plains, Jed, Alara, and Silas Croft met in the deep shadows. Their faces, illuminated by the faint starlight, were set with a grim and unwavering determination. Deputy Caleb had done his part. The lock on the back window of the sheriff's office was loose enough to be jimmied open with a knife, and the other on-duty deputy, a lazy man named Peters, was thoroughly occupied. A drunken brawl, loud and convincingly chaotic, had erupted in the Gilded Cage Saloon. A bit of theater secretly started and expertly fueled by 3 of Silas's most loyal and brawny ranch hands. The town was a powder keg of secrets and lies, and they were about to light the fuse. "You two be careful now," Silas whispered, his voice a low growl. He gripped the stock of the heavy rifle he held. "I will be right here. Anything goes wrong, you will hear from me." He was too old and too large for the kind of stealth this job required. Jed and Alara were the ones to go in. Jed squeezed the old rancher's shoulder in thanks, then turned to Alara. In the dim light, he saw no fear in her eyes, only a fierce, focused resolve. She gave him a single, sharp nod. Together, they slipped away from Silas and melted into the darkened alleyways of the town. The very place they had once fled from now felt like enemy territory. Every deep shadow a potential threat, every gust of wind a warning. They moved like ghosts, their boots making no sound on the hard-packed dirt, their hearts pounding in a silent, frantic rhythm. They reached the back of the sheriff's office without incident. Jed used his knife to work the window latch, and after a moment of tense scraping, it gave way. He slid the window up, and they slipped inside, one after the other, into the suffocating darkness. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke, cheap whiskey, and the metallic scent of oiled gunmetal. A thin sliver of moonlight, filtering through the grimy front window, was the only illumination. They moved with a desperate, quiet urgency, their hands sweeping across the floor, searching for the loose board Caleb had described. It was Alara, her senses heightened by the surge of adrenaline. Who found it? Her fingers brushed against the edge of a board that felt different from the others. She pried at it with her fingernails, and it lifted silently. There, nestled in the dark space below, was a thick, leather-bound book. It was exactly as Caleb had described. Jed reached down and took the ledger. The weight of it in his hands felt immense, the weight of truth, of justice. As he stood up, the book clutched in his hand. They both froze. From outside, on the wooden boardwalk, came the sound of heavy, familiar footsteps. It was Brody. He had returned early. There was no time to get back out the window. They were trapped. The key turned in the lock, and the front door creaked open. Brody entered the office, his large silhouette blocking the moonlight from the street. He stopped just inside the doorway, sensing immediately that something was amiss. The air was different. He could not see them in the near-total darkness, but he could feel their presence, a disruption in the stagnant air of his corrupt sanctuary. "I know you are in here," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that seemed to vibrate in the small space. His hand rested on the butt of his holstered gun. Jed shoved Alara gently but firmly behind the heavy oak desk, shielding her with its bulk. Then, taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the shadows, the ledger held up in his hand. "It is over, Brody." Brody's face, a pale oval in the gloom, contorted with a mask of pure, murderous rage. His hand moved with surprising speed, his gun clearing the leather of his holster. But Jed was faster, his own Colt seeming to leap into his hand. The office exploded with the deafening, ear-splitting roar of a gunshot. But it was not Jed's gun that had fired. From the open doorway, his face pale but resolute in the moonlight, stood Deputy Caleb Parker. His own revolver was smoking in his hand. He had made his choice. He had shot Brody in the arm, the bullet tearing through the sheriff's shoulder and sending his pistol clattering to the floor. The look of betrayal that flashed in Brody's eyes was more potent and painful than the wound itself. Before anyone could react, before Jed or Caleb could move to subdue him, Brody, clutching his bleeding arm, lunged with his other hand and smashed the glass of the oil lamp on his desk. Kerosene sloshed across a scattered pile of papers and the dry wooden floor. Fire erupted with a hungry whoosh, spreading instantly, turning the office into a chaotic inferno of thick, choking smoke and swirling flames. The final confrontation spilled out onto the main street of Redemption. Drawn by the sound of the gunshot and the sudden, terrifying sight of flames leaping from the sheriff's office, townsfolk began to pour out of the saloon and their homes, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. Brody, his face a demonic mask illuminated by the flames from his burning office, staggered out onto the boardwalk, pointing a shaking, bloody finger at Jed. "He has attacked me!" Brody screamed, his voice raw with pain and fury. The outlaw Thorn and his witch, they came to murder me in my own office." At that moment, as if summoned by the chaos, the remaining members of Finn's gang, who had been waiting for Brody at the edge of town, heard the commotion. Seeing their plans unraveling, they made a desperate decision. They spurred their horses and rode into town, their guns blazing, hoping to silence everyone in the ensuing panic and make their escape. The main street of Redemption became a battlefield. It was not a heroic, stylized Western shootout from a dime novel. It was a desperate, terrifying, and clumsy fight for life. Men shouted, women screamed, and the night was filled with the chaotic sounds of gunfire and the shattering of glass. Jed and Caleb took cover behind a watering trough, returning fire, their shots careful and deliberate. From the shadows across the street, Silas Croft and his ranch hands joined the fray, their rifles providing crucial, covering fire. In a pivotal, heart-stopping moment, one of the outlaws, his face a snarl of desperation, got the drop on Caleb, whose gun was empty. The outlaw cornered the unarmed deputy against a wall, his pistol raising for the kill. From the mouth of the alleyway nearby, Ilara watched it happen. The heavy pistol Jed had given her was in her hand. Her hands were shaking, the weapon feeling impossibly heavy, but her aim, honed by weeks of practice in the mountains, was steady. She controlled her breath. Just as Jed had taught her, she fired. The outlaw grunted, a look of shock on his face, and crumpled to the ground. It was a defining act, a final, irrevocable shedding of her victimhood. She was no longer a girl to be saved, but a fighter, defending the people who had finally, in the end, stood by her. The fight was as short as it was brutal. When the acrid gun smoke finally began to clear, the last of the outlaws had either fled or lay dead in the street. Sheriff Brody, weakened from his wound, was captured, held securely by two of Silas's men. The town of Redemption stood in a shocked, ringing silence, the only sound the roar of the fire that was now consuming the symbol of its corrupt authority. In the flickering firelight, Jed walked to the center of the street. He held the captured ledger high for all to see. "Here is your truth, redemption," he shouted, his voice ringing with righteous fury through the stunned street. He handed the book to Silas Croft. The old rancher, his face grim, opened the ledger, in a loud, clear voice that carried to every corner of the street. He began to read. He read the entries detailing Brody's years of corruption, the payments received for his silence, the names of men he had protected. And then he read the final, damning entry, the one detailing the payment received for information leading to the ambush and murder of the Hayes family. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The townsfolk were forced, at last, to confront the ugly, corrosive truth they had chosen to ignore for so long, the bitter prejudice they had harbored against an innocent girl to soothe their own fears. The heavy silence was finally broken by a woman in the crowd, who began to weep, a sound of profound and collective shame. In the days that followed, the town of Redemption began a slow, painful, and necessary process of atonement. A federal marshal was sent for, and Brody and his captured cronies were taken away in chains to stand trial, one by one, and in small, awkward groups. The townsfolk approached Ilara. They offered clumsy apologies, their eyes unable to meet hers. They offered to rebuild her cabin. The town council offered her a plot of land within the town limits. Their gestures were sincere, born of a newfound shame. But the wounds were too deep. Redemption would never be her home. Its name would forever be a bitter, painful irony. Justice had been served, but the place itself was tainted by the ghosts of memory. The final scene found Jed and Ilara a week later, on a high ridge overlooking the valley. They sat on two strong horses, their packs filled with supplies gifted to them by a remorseful and grateful Silas Croft. The rising sun was just beginning to set the eastern horizon ablaze with breathtaking colors of hope and promise. They were not riding away as defeated refugees, but as free people, as partners who had faced the very worst of the world and had survived it, together. The scars remained, the thin, pale line on her forehead, the puckered skin on her arm, the haunted look that would sometimes still shadow his eyes. But they were no longer marks of shame or weakness. They were symbols of their resilience, of their shared and hard-won victory. The vast, harsh landscape that had once seemed like a prison now represented a future of infinite possibility. He reached over, his calloused hand covering hers where it rested on the saddle horn. "Where to?" he asked, his voice soft in the morning air. She looked at him, her eyes clear and full of a love that had been tested by fire and tempered by tragedy into something unbreakable. She squeezed his hand and turned her gaze toward the open, sun-drenched horizon. "Somewhere new," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable strength. Together, they turned their horses and rode into the sunrise, not running from the past, but riding towards a future they would build together, one day at a time. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.